This is lecture number 13 in the Introduction to Ethics, RPH 205. So we are talking now about the mechanistic worldview as Fritjof Capra spoke about it. And we covered Descartes last time. He was one of the mechanists. These are both of these people studied Newtonian physics, which is based on math. And then they wanted to take that way that math understands physics and the world, the natural world. They wanted to use that as a paradigm for all of our thoughts in relation not only to the natural world, but also to our own will, to how to live. That was Descartes. Now, Kant also has his own version of mechanistic worldview. It's also detached. Mind and body are detached. And he also has a more extensive view of ethics and politics, how to act in the world. So, so he tends to be more influential when it comes to ethical reasoning. And so we will go from there. Um, so here's Kant, Kant's worldview. Let's see over here. All right. So Kant was reading David Hume. David Hume is called a skeptic because David Hume said, we really don't know anything. We don't know if the sun will rise tomorrow because knowledge is absolutely true, necessarily true, objectively true. But the trouble is, nothing in the material world is necessarily true, objectively true, or logical, right? That isn't, we don't get the notion that everything fits together into a coherent, logically consistent system of laws, body of laws. We don't get that from observing sense things. So when we're observing something based on our sensations, we they're never objectively true. They're never necessarily true. Those are mathematical concepts. 2 plus 2 is 4. So we can say that every time I drop this pen, it falls, right? And it hits my computer and it stops. And that'll happen over and over again. So we can predict that it's highly probable. And Newton would say, well, it's the law of gravity. It's just that Hume said, you can't get from the sense world where to mathematical absolute truth because the characteristics of the Newtonian system do not fit with the material world that they're supposed to describe. So Descartes just thought, well, I'm going to make them fit, right? If it doesn't fit, it's not a clear and distinct idea. So, I mean, Descartes was you superimpose, right? You just superimpose mathematical truths onto the world. Well, David Hume is bringing this up that, wait a second, the world is subjective. The way you see me is different than the way I see you, right? Our perceptions are subjective. They're very much relative to our own point of view, our perspective. They're not necessarily true, even to the point where it's not true that I necessarily existed, ever came to be born. That wasn't necessary. It's not necessary that this pen exists. So Immanuel Kant had been teaching Newtonian mechanics for 20 years, and he just assumed that this body of Newtonian laws that are absolute, necessarily true, logically true, internally consistent, fit with the outside world. And Hume said, there's no reason to think that, right? That's where Descartes would say, this judgment that what I have, the ideas in my mind correspond to the world, right? So Hume is saying that's a false judgment. It's unscientific. It's not necessarily true. It's not even probably true. It's impossible. It's not true at all because there's nothing in material world that would lend itself to necessary laws. All right. All we know about the sun rising tomorrow, it's highly probable. So now you have probability, and calculus is based on probabilities. But Kant said, Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumbers. All right. I had been assuming this, and now I have to figure out what I really think, right? He has to reevaluate, he has to doubt what he assumed, and he has to come up with something else. All right, this is what he came up with. Okay, so what he had assumed, he taught Newtonian physics. And Newtonian physics why this doesn't just come up, but okay. Okay, so, all right. So Kant's goal, and he set himself to it. He took decades to figure it out, or he took however much time, just like Descartes. I'm going to separate myself. I'm going to figure out what I really think. How can I show that Newtonian science, scientific knowledge, is really about the natural world? And how can I show that scientific knowledge is necessarily true? How am I going to prove that? Because how do I get from the categories of necessity, objectivity, logical consistency? How do I get from those categories of science to the natural world, right? All right, so then he divides every proposition, every sentence that we utter is either based on reason apart from experience. 2 plus 2 is 4, right? Descartes liked reason apart from experience. That's a priori. A triangle is a polygon with 3 sides. That's in your head. There's also in Newtonian physics a principle of identity. A thing is what it is and no other thing. Okay. Now, in the real world, things change all the time. So this is a principle of reason. The principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot both be and not be in the same sense, at the same time, in the same place, right? Non-contradiction. Now, can you prove that based on all the empirical data we get? No, it's a principle. It's a filter through which we look at the world and through which we organize our science. And then Aristotle actually thought, in his view of final causes, that principle of identity and non-contradiction were actually arose out of our observations of the natural world. It's because identity was connected to species. So every natural thing that you observe has identity as a member of a species. Whereas the principle of identity in Newton is detached from its natural place. It's detached from species. It's the pen is what this pen is what it is and no other thing, right? It's an existential thing. It's this pen. Whereas if you saw a squirrel, the squirrel is primarily what it is, and the reason it exists is because it's a member of a species, and the species has found a niche in the chain of being. So the principle of identity itself means something a priori in the modern world, something our reason superimposes, where for Aristotle, it just emerges after studying nature. Principle of non-contradiction. Again, for Aristotle, that emerges. It's based on the natural world. It comes as a result of our studies of the natural world. But that's not the way the moderns, they superimpose that as a matter of rational principle, clarity, right? A clear and distinct idea that they impose onto the, the natural world to create their body of scientific laws. Okay, there's other kinds of truth that we know come from experience. And Descartes distinguished that too, like colors and shapes, right? I don't have an a priori idea of color or cats. So the cat is on the mat is just a fact, an empirical fact about something in the world. That's a posteriori. We never would have thought of cats or mats or cats being on mats without having experience. It's all based on experience. Um, so Kant separated reason or thinking into two fundamentally different parts, before experience and after experience. Aristotle did not do that, right? Analytic propositions do not add anything to knowledge. So they break down the meaning of a term, like a line is the shortest distance between 2 points. That doesn't add anything to knowledge. That just clarifies it is a definition, right? Or a triangle is three-sided, and the 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 angles of the triangle are equal to two right angles. Okay, those are analytic. That's what follows from a set of definitions. Synthetic propositions do add. Wait, the analytic proposition would be that a triangle is a three-sided polygon. The synthetic proposition is that the sum of the angles equals two right angles because you're reasoning about the triangle. Okay, so there's four possible kinds of truth. There's an analytic truth that's a priori. Parallel lines never meet, right? That's pretty much defining a parallel line. You can figure out its truth, you can state it from the point of view of your pure reason. It's your pure reason that knows that. Analytic a posteriori is something like the notion of a bachelor. You don't get a notion of a bachelor from your head, you get it from your experience. But then a bachelor is an unmarried man is also like a definition, but it's a definition about an object that's based on experience. Okay, synthetic a posteriori is that the cat is on the mat is not a definition, it's an observation. So it's based on experience and it's putting things together in a new way. The cat just went out the door. The cat, blah, blah, right? Where a bachelor is an a bachelor is an unmarried man My friend, the bachelor, just left to go eat dinner, right? That's synthetic a posteriori. So the things we would call empirical facts are just sentences that he would call synthetic a posteriori. They're telling you about something, some additional information based on after experience, based on experience. Okay. Now, Kant's big flash was that his big revelation was that the truths of mathematics are not analytic a priori. They're not just definitions adding to definitions. Okay, let me right. They're not just a bunch of mathematical games that you play. You know, the whole system is just based on your brain, right? But the truths of mathematics are synthetic. You actually learn things from mathematics. You synthesize things. You gain knowledge just by um, by drawing inferences from drawing mathematical inferences. Okay, so you build up a system of new knowledge based on a priori concepts of pure reason. All right, the laws of science. Okay, the laws of science are synthetic a priori. All right, so they're built up from the pure laws of reason, which are necessity, logically consistent. That's a law, that's a concept of reason. Objectivity, right? Necessity. Those are based on our head. But scientific laws are synthetic a priori. When we study Newton's laws, we study the law of gravity, we study a thing in motion will stay in motion until friction hits it. These are concepts of reason, but they build up into a body of knowledge. So these scientific laws are necessarily true. Scientific causes are necessary because the concepts of causality and necessity are concepts of reason. So the pen does necessarily drop because the law of gravity is necessarily true and objectively true, universally true, logically consistent within a system. Okay, so necessity and causality do not exist in the material world. He agrees with that with Hume. Hume awakened him to the fact that he kept projecting the notions of necessity and causality into the world. But they're the way our minds, our reason interacts with the material world. This is the thing. We impose our system. The system, the Newtonian system, is imposed by reason, by pure reason, onto the world in order to make sense of the world. Okay. All right, so it's like you have rose-colored glasses. You've ever heard of the expression, you're looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, right? These aren't rose-colored, but I don't have, like sunglasses, right? So the world looks different if you have sunglasses on because you're filtering the world through your own set of categories. So he says that human beings by nature have this reason. They're born with innate, just like Descartes said, innate ideas. They're born with these innate categories of necessity, logical consistency, universality, objectivity. Those are categories in our head. And we impose them onto the world. The key there is the difference between phenomena and noumena. So how do you account for the fact that these things are contingent, materialistic? They don't exist necessarily. How are you going to do that? He says, we have to distinguish between the things in themselves. Okay. So the pen is, I filter it. In a way, I don't really know what's out there. I don't know the noumena, but that's because my reason won't take it in. My reason only experiences phenomena, right? Things as we experience them are the objects as we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch them. Those are the things that exist in space and time. And okay, so Newton's system does apply to phenomena because Newton's science had absolute space and time. So our minds block out whatever doesn't fit with our system. Our minds only function with these structures of absolute space and time. And then within that, our minds take in whatever's out there in the world and fit it into the system of laws. And so Kant says, yes, we have to not be so arrogant. What Newtonian science knows is actually just the way we experience the world. It's not, we have every reason in the world to think there's a lot more stuff out there that we don't experience. Well, I mean, Aristotle had a naturalistic and analogous. For Aristotle, some some animals can see better than we can, some can hear better than we can, some can smell better, and that's related to their survival, their ability to flourish. The reason we have the degree of sight, smelling, and hearing, why we have them to the level we have them is because we have enough to use our minds to understand the world. Now, that is not Aristotle, right? Kant says the reason we experience the world, the phenomenon, the way we do is because we do it in a way that will fit with these categories of reason without experience. So we come in with a set of blinders on, and we just live. Our human culture occurs within that context of blinders. Lots of blinders, right? Well, space and time, and then we fit everything in there, and universal laws and objective laws and all that. But we should be humble and realize there's other stuff out there. We just don't know what it is. So by dividing reality into two, right? There's the phenomenon, the things as we experience them. And then there's the noumena, what they are in themselves. Okay, by splitting that, Kant can say that we do have necessary knowledge of the phenomena. We can impose our categories of necessity and causality, universality, objectivity, logical consistency. We can impose all of those categories because we're imposing them on the phenomena, the way we experience things. So he makes an analogy between what he has done for the meaning of science and what Copernicus did. Copernicus, before he changed the model, people thought the Earth was at the center, and then you explained the rotation of the planets through these ellipses, right? So they had these very complicated orbits in order to explain it. If you assume the Earth's at the center, the only way to explain these observations you've made is these very complicated orbits. And Copernicus just said, well, what if we just change that entirely? Instead of everything rotating around us, why don't we, the sun, right? Even we rotate around the sun. So we're not the center anymore, right? And the reason Copernicus was chosen in favor is it was a way simpler. That's why Aristotle would agree with it, incidentally. But Kant said it's analogous to that. We had assumed that what we thought in here corresponded to what was out there. So it's the same with Descartes. They're rejecting the correspondence theory of truth, which was Aristotle's view. So now if we just realize there isn't a correspondent, we're more humble. We don't claim that. We actually realize that the science we created is created by us, by the way our brains are structured, the way we take things in. So we force the world to conform to our categories. And in order to do that, we just block out what doesn't fit with our categories. So as human nature, as the rational creature, we study the world in a way which enables our reason, our a priori reason we have before experience, to formulate all of our results, all of our data into a body of scientific laws. So we have this filter of space and time, and they're the structure of our intuition. So Aristotle's intuition was very much connected to the world. Their intuition is not. It's disconnected. Okay, so the nature of scientific laws, they're universally true, necessarily true, internally consistent, follow the laws of non-contradiction and identity, objectively true, cause-effect relationships, the laws of logic. And they construct human reason in its relationship to phenomena. So what we think of as science is about phenomena. All right. So then we have these other questions that our reason cannot answer, right? If our reason looks at phenomenon and creates science, Newtonian science, what about why is there anything at all, right? Our reason can't answer that. What do the laws of reason apply to? What don't they apply to? Of course, we don't know that. What's the relationship between phenomena and noumena? There's no way our reason can tell us that. What is the noumena? We can't, our reason can't tell us that. It just tells us what the phenomena is. Does the human soul exist? Well, our reason can't tell us that. Reason, the soul is not a phenomenon. It's not something in space and time. Is the soul immortal? Well, we can't. There's no way we can answer that. And does free will exist? So again, reason, we can't answer that because free will is not an object of reason. Okay, and then Kant wants to argue it's more reasonable for our reason to conclude that there does exist a God who created the universe than it is to deny that a God exists, right? Because we know from studying the phenomena that the universe didn't cause itself. So it does need a cause, and that's God. So it's more reasonable to believe in God as the first cause than to deny it, right? Denying a first cause makes no sense because phenomena are not self-caused. Reason wants to know the cause and cannot answer the question or explain it from what it does know. But it's more reasonable to believe these things. And so I'll show you in the next section on ethics. This one is just, it's more reasonable to think there's a God because phenomena needs a cause. And then the next section of the lecture is, it's more reasonable to believe in the human soul, freedom, and immortality than to deny that they exist. But it's an indirect proof, right? Reason will never know these things because they're not phenomena. But based on what reason does know, it makes more sense to think they exist, to believe in them, than not to believe in them. So how do we get to that conclusion? All right, so keep in mind his view of reason is our capacity to take phenomena and and take in phenomena and make laws. So how is it? So when we direct our mind to what we think of, well, the phenomena, the natural phenomena outside of human affairs, we make Newtonian physics. What about when we direct our mind to the realm of human culture and to figuring out how to act? So if you remember with Descartes, he had to meditation number 4. How am I supposed to figure out how to act? Right? So this is Kant, okay? So reason consists in this activity of creating laws. When it's turned toward the natural world, it applies its a priori concepts, creates a body of scientific laws. The body of laws gets larger and larger as we digest more and more phenomena. We're synthesizing new data, we're creating new knowledge, but the categories according to which it grasps the natural world, the phenomena is structured into the human mind, space-time, okay? Because the laws are directed toward the natural world, they are universal and objective and necessarily true and all that. Okay? Why is there anything at all? Those are the antinomies of reason. And so it's more reasonable to believe that. Now, what about the soul, free will, and immortality? All right, well, let's go to that. What do we know? All right, we know that there is a realm of noumena and phenomena. We know that. What do we know in relation to ourselves? Well, we know that if all we are is our phenomena, which is our body that exists in space and time, that's subject to gravity, all that stuff, if that's all we are, then our behavior occurs by necessity, right? It's just as inevitable as the law of gravity, forcing the pen down. That means all of our behavior is forced by necessity. It's logically consistent. It's objective, whatever. It abides, if we are phenomena only, our behavior has to be determined. There's no free will. So whatever I choose was the result of causes, other causes, and they led inevitably to my choice, my behavior. So if there's no free will, then there's no free will. If there's no free will, there's no moral accountability. You can't hold anybody accountable for their behavior because it was just caused necessarily. Like you can't hold the pen accountable for falling when you let it go. You can't hold a person accountable for behaving however they do because there was some whole set of other causes that led inevitably to this effect, to your behavior. But it's more reasonable to think, just like everything else, that human beings are also phenomena and noumena. It's more reasonable to think that we also have a noumenal aspect to our humanity, right? Humanity isn't just our phenomenal self, okay? Everything else in the universe is more than it appears. So it's reasonable to think we are more than how we appear to ourselves, to each other. And okay, and the world, right? We are more than just our bodies in motion. Okay. Further, we can get to the conclusion that we are a noumena just because of our own consciousness, right? When we think, we are conscious of ourselves as having bodies that are subject to the laws of nature. We are conscious of ourselves as rational creatures that create this body of laws. And we're also, we're conscious of ourselves as being motivated by pleasure and pain and other phenomena, right? Why did I get mad? Well, because my sister hit me. That's why, right? So there's she hits, I get mad, you know? So that's all the realm of inclinations. Treating ourselves as a thing. We're just reacting. We're just physical things. But we're also conscious of ourselves as having pure reason, the ability to create this body of laws, to understand the world. But we're also conscious of ourselves. You know, your mother would have said, well, you still should not have gotten angry. You ought not to have gotten so angry at her, right? She ought not to have hit you. You ought not to have gotten that angry, right? Okay, where do we get that concept of ought? Where do we get these concepts of it's morally right or it's morally wrong? Where do they come from? There's nothing in the phenomenal world that would lead to any kind of judgment, like it's morally wrong for the pen to drop. You know, it's not morally wrong for mass to be subject to the law of gravity, right? So where did we get these ideas, right? Well, we get them from our reason, our a priori reason. Okay, we are capable of thinking of ourselves as being motivated either by phenomenon or by a moral law. Okay, so thou shalt not hit, right? Thou shalt not get angry at your brother. Jesus says that, right? Go make peace with your brother and then come and settle with me, right? So the very fact that that's the way we operate, right? We're always talking like this. You ought not to do that. It's wrong. It's right. Okay. The golden rule, you ought to follow the golden rule, right? Well, that's because it's more reasonable to think we actually have a noumenal self, and that noumenal self has free will because that's why we're accountable. We're only accountable if we have free will, but it is reasonable to think that we have it because we're consciously aware that we can act on the basis of inclinations or we can give to ourselves a moral law. Okay, if we can even just conceive of ourselves as being motivated by a good will, a will to desire to follow the moral law or inclination, the way we conceive of ourselves is that we have choice. And if we conceive of ourselves that way, that is what it means to have a will. To have the concept of a will is to have a will. The very, oh my gosh, the very foundation of, let's see, of the proposition, I ought to do this, but I want to do that, means that you have a will. Since we can conceive of ourselves as a noumena rather than just a phenomena, and we can conceive of ourselves as having a choice, therefore a will, it's more reasonable to believe we have a free will than to believe we don't have it. I hope you understand that. It's more reasonable to think that we have choice because we have this reason and we keep telling ourselves to follow our reason. And it must come from a noumenal self. It doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't come from phenomena. So it must come from noumena. Um, so then we can think of ourselves as free and not free. Our phenomenal self is not free. The physical, we can't defy the law of gravity. We can't not be threatened by threats, right? To our survival. We have survival instinct. But so our phenomenal self is not free, but we can always stand up to threats. We can always choose, well, are you going to run away from that threat? Are you going to stand up to it because of something you believe in? Or what are you going to do? Like, we always have a choice. We can always act on a moral law rather than on our phenomenal instinctual impulse. So it's reasonable to believe that we are not subject to necessary laws, but that we have reason and we can give ourselves a moral law. Okay. So whenever we have to make a decision, we can become aware of what our inclination, what we're inclined to do, but also what the moral law requires of us. So the definition of a good will is the will to choose to follow reason, the moral law, abiding by the moral law, and doing it for its own sake, just because it is the right thing to do, just because the moral law, reason, tells you to do it, or that is the demand of reason. So a good will is more important than intelligence, wealth, or any other gift because it determines how your gifts are used. The greatest natural gifts and the most wonderful environment can be used to do evil if it's not motivated by a good will. Okay? On the other hand, a good will shines forth as having moral worth, even when no one knows the purity of someone's will, even when the consequences of acting from a good will don't always turn out pleasing to everyone else, right? If you had good intentions, then you have a good will. You didn't do what's wrong. You did the right thing because you were following a good will. An action should not be considered good or evil on the basis of its consequences, since there are many factors involved which determine its consequences. Rather, the action has moral worth when it's motivated by a good will. All right, does everybody understand that's important? Kant does not care about the consequences. That's phenomenal. Cares about the purity of your heart and the clarity of your head, right? Just like Descartes, clear and distinct ideas. It's very similar in that sense. And Descartes said, I'll only act on clear and distinct ideas. Well, Kant says, I will only act on the moral law. I will have a good will and I will only act on the moral law. Okay, then our reason creates a body of moral laws. And they should be consistent. They should prioritize, right? There should be priorities. And you should be able to have a logically consistent body of moral laws. But those laws will never be necessarily true because people can always act on the moral law or not, right? So it's not necessarily going to happen. It's not objectively true because human beings can bring in subjectivity and think whatever they like or do whatever they like. Even if it's a dictate of reason, it will not necessarily be true. Even when it's objectively the best thing to be, it's not necessarily going to happen. People have to choose. Because moral laws are not necessarily true, They're framed as commandments. You ought to do this. They cannot be merely predictions. You will do X, because we can never predict human behavior. Free will just means you always have a choice. Kant calls the commands of the moral law categorical imperatives because they're framed as universal. You must do X, or you ought to do X. Absolutely no exceptions. Everyone in the same situation, if they want to have a good will, must do the same thing. It's true for everyone, no exceptions. Okay, it's categorically true. The universality of the moral law is articulated in Kant's first principle, according to which all choices should be made. I am never to act otherwise than so that I could always will that my maxim, what I'm telling myself to do, should become a universal law. Okay? For example, don't tell a lie, right? So if I am tempted to tell a lie and I don't tell a lie, I'm acting. You can't. Okay. So say your grandma dyed her hair gray and it turned out kind of blue. And she asks you, well, how do you like it? And you lie. You tell her you like it. So that's a lie. You shouldn't treat her that way because you're treating her like she can't handle the truth. You're treating her like she's irrational. You have to pander to her desire for approval, right? You can tell her the truth. She's a rational being. Just tell her what you think. So you should always treat people according to reason. Treat them assuming they do have a mind, reason, and you're going to appeal to their reason, not to their emotions. Since human beings are capable of choice, and when they make the right choices, they act from a good will, and a good will is the most perfect thing in the universe because everything else runs on necessity. Kant believes that human nature is of infinite dignity and worth, right? Everything else is a phenomenon. All other motion, everything in the natural world and a lot of human behavior, but human behavior motivated by a good will has infinite worth beyond everything else, right? It's always wrong to treat other people merely as phenomena, as objects of your own pleasure or pain. Human beings must always be treated as of infinite worth. So act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, in every case as an end, never as a means only. This is absolute, no exceptions. So when I go to check out at the grocery store, I don't treat the cashier just as a means to my end. I can't get out of this store unless she checks me out. I have to treat her also as a rational being and respect her and don't boss her around. Don't treat her the way that you would want to be treated, the golden rule, and respect her as having infinite worth. Okay? Always. All right. Kant also recognized sometimes a person is motivated by a good will and still suffers unjustly. On the other hand, people are motivated by inclination and they get rewarded. Life on earth does not follow the desire of human reason to want a connection between a good will and a reward and a bad will and punishment, right? Our reason tells us if I have a good will, I ought to be. If I act on reason, I shouldn't suffer, especially not unjustly. But that isn't what happens, right? If somebody has a bad will, they should suffer because it's just for them to suffer. But that isn't what happens. But since it's rational, our minds want there to be a cause-effect connection. So that's built into our reason, is this desire or this assumption or just reason requires a requirement that goodness, there's a connection between being good and being happy, and being evil and being unhappy, but it doesn't happen. So it's also reasonable to think the human soul is immortal, and after death, everyone does receive their just rewards or punishments. It's more reasonable to believe in eternal justice than it is to believe that we have this concept of free will, of following reason or inclination, of just rewards or punishments for our choices, and still say that ultimately there's no resolution of the injustices in this world. So it's more reasonable to think there is an ultimate resolution where the just are rewarded, the unjust are punished. And so the only way that can be true is if the soul is immortal. And in the afterlife, there are rewards and punishments. Okay. So Kant thinks that by distinguishing between the phenomena and the noumena, what has he accomplished, which he thinks is great? He's preserved the validity of necessary scientific laws. He's established the reasonableness of belief in God. He's preserved the belief in free will in the face of a scientific method that might deny it. And he's preserved the belief in the immortality of the soul. So all of these positions are based on our own experience of what reason, a priori reason, built in, knows, does not know. So he's limited the scope of reason and made room for a new understanding of what it means to believe in God, freedom, and immortality. Now they're understood as part of the noumena, the reality that our reason does not know. Yet our reason knows its limits and knows that it's more reasonable to humble itself and recognize that it's more reasonable to think there are realities outside of itself. There's more to reason than reason knows, right? It's more reasonable to do that. A really careful self-examination of your reason would lead you to believe in these other realities. You can't know them. So again, you have the split between what science knows and what faith claims, except that there's no gap. It's reasonable to think there are limits to reason, okay? So both Kant and Descartes have a relationship between reason and belief in God, right? And in Kant's, and also the soul and Descartes could also go along with eternal reward and punishment, because we know how we're supposed to how we're supposed to act. And it's a sin, it's an error to misuse our gift of judgment. And so it makes sense that there would be an ultimate reward or punishment according to how we act. Same with Kant, okay? But the main points here are they split reason and faith in a way that Aristotle did not. And Capra talks about spirituality as this synthesis, this integrity of what's inside of you and what's outside of you, right? This, the energy. You are a microcosm in the macrocosm. This is not the modern world. Descartes and Kant, you're born with these innate ideas of reason. And it does lead to reason limiting itself and assuming there is a God. But it's a very different kind of understanding of God. It's a very different idea of what it means to believe in God, or to think it's more reasonable to assume the existence of God. It's very different. And That's why it's a new paradigm. There's a new paradigm for ethics. So we're going to go to the how do you teach a child to be ethical, to behave? How are you going to teach children how to behave? Well, here's the method. For Aristotle, you had childhood habituation. You teach them pleasure and pain. But Aristotle's method was, I mean, Kant's method is different than Aristotle's, okay? Aristotle wanted children are habituated to learn how to feel pleasure and fear. And the most important thing is that by the time they grow up, they take pleasure in good judgment, in helping people out, and flourishing. Okay, but that's not the way Kant understands how you, and it makes sense how he says how to raise kids. It's consistent with his view. So, given that we have free will and we have to choose between inclination or reason, right? And reason dictates a moral law. Okay, reason is the activity of soul which distinguishes us from animals. It's the source of our dignity. Therefore, kids should be taught from a young age to have the greatest respect for their reason and to follow the moral law dictated by reason at all times, to put everything else after the holiness of duty, and to know that we can do it because our own reason acknowledges it as its law and says that we ought to do it. It is, as it were, to lift ourselves altogether out of the world of sense. Descartes had the same thing, is that if you act on clear and distinct ideas, you impose them onto the world of sense. Kant, same, you lift yourself out of the world of sense. You don't pay any attention to your inclinations, your emotions. You train yourself to honor the moral law. So you should just not have any other emotions, or the desire to have a good will would be the number one emotion, and it would override any other emotions, because any other emotions are inclination. Okay, because this is so important, you have to have a method to make people conscious of their freedom to act according to a good will and to follow reason. So they have to have a method. They have to be raised to have a certain kind of character. Um, yeah, okay. What's the method? Okay, from right as soon as they are young, you develop the habit of judging actions according to whether they're motivated by a moral law, your own and other people's actions. So you sharpen these judgments by specifying if an action conforms to a moral law or not, and if so, which one. So again, you're sitting at the dinner table and Johnny is complaining, right? My friend so-and-so hit me, right? Or he lied to me. And the parents, well, okay, so the parents find out their kid hit and they come. And so the kid says, well, he hit me first. And the parent just says, stop. That's not a reason, right? Stop that. It's wrong just to react. What you have to do is learn to think of the moral law. Do you like getting hit? No. Okay, if the golden rule, if you don't want to get hit, don't hit. Just act on your reason. Don't act on your emotion, your inclination, your desire. The one desire you should have is the desire to follow the moral law, reason. And your reason tells you, obviously, you should not hit. You find out Johnny says, well, my friend lied to me, so I lied back. Stop. You don't want to get lied to. It's not rational. Follow the moral law. Have a good will. Forget all your inclinations, okay? And you just practice that. Keep practicing. Determine, and not only that, but the child, you do it out of respect for the moral law. You respect yourself as a rational creature. You're capable of being rational. So, okay, so, you have to, Johnny, maybe Johnny says, hey, Dad, my friend hit me and I didn't hit him back. So can I go buy myself a present? Wait a sec. You weren't doing it just out of respect for the moral law. You were doing it because you thought you'd get a reward. That's inclination. Your inclinations are motivating you. All right. So you have to do it out of respect. There's no reward. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. And your reason takes satisfaction. You're happy that you follow these laws. You just have to keep practicing. The notion of a purely good will arises from these discussions, right? A child becomes aware of the power of their reason and the fact that they can have a good will. They become more and more conscious of their freedom. Now you have freedom. You can always choose. You don't have to react. You can detach yourself from inclination and be motivated just by the dictate of reason. Then you'll be free from all the distractions of inclination and you'll feel an inner freedom. It's worth it, right? Just to know that you don't have to react to anything around you and that you shouldn't, right? Because you are worth more than that. The people behaving that way are also worth more. So you should always treat them like a rational being. You don't fight back. You don't hit back. And you can even tell them, don't you have more respect for yourself as a rational creature? Why would you want to lie? Why would you want to hit? Because people have dignity and worth in their choice, their free choice, their goodwill, and their reason. So they develop a sense of reverence for their freedom and their reason. They leave their other inclinations behind. They have a feeling of liberation. So children should not be focused on heroic acts, being a hero, because that's contextual and that you're focused on that because you want to be recognized by other people. And lots of times, that isn't what your life requires of you. Mostly, you should just do your duty. You just have examples of other people who've done their duty. For example, the New York firefighters at 9/11, they happen to go down in history as heroes. But the main point is not that they were heroes, but that they were doing their duty as firefighters, right? So children shouldn't be fantasizing about being a hero. They should every day do the right thing. So moral characters based on concepts and principles, not on emotions and moods. So don't conjure up moods to get children focused. They should be trained to always ask, what is my duty? What is right? As they get older, they should ask, what principle should motivate my actions that I can also will to be a universal principle for all human beings in this situation, right? So gradually they grow up. Gradually they become more and more conscious. They can act on principle. they can do what's right. They can worship, honor, respect the power of their reason, the power of a goodwill, and then they can treat other people as potentially having that power. Now, here's some examples. Someone is deciding whether or not to commit suicide. Well, could you will that to be a universal law? Should everybody commit suicide? No. Human beings by nature are of infinite worth. There's no way human reason would will to deliberately kill a human being, including yourself, right? There's no way that that's rational. There's no way there's a moral law for that. Well, then you say, but the context, the person is in all sorts of pain, blah, blah. That means you're treating yourself like a thing. You're committing suicide because you're treating yourself like a thing. You're depressed, you lost your friends, you don't have a job. No, you're treating yourself like a thing, like a mere phenomenon. Your pure reason doesn't worry about jobs or friends, it just acts on principle. So you have to have a good will. Whether or not to tell a lie, to borrow money, to say you will pay it back without intending to pay it back. Well, you ask yourself, you tell you, I need the money. Okay, but that's an inclination. That's phenomena. You're treating yourself like a phenomenon. All you're thinking about is a phenomenal context. Can you will that everybody lies? Borrows money, saying you'll pay it back and lie. No, they won't. Can you will that to be universal law? No. Well, don't do it. You have to respect yourself so that even if you run into circumstances, you'll still act on the moral law. You'll have a good will. Reason would never agree to that because reason will not say, oh, I guess the circumstances are kind of bad. So, okay, this time, make an exception. No, reason doesn't operate that way. Okay, whether or not to cultivate a talent. All right. So, reason, human beings have many capacities. And so so you find out that actually you're pretty good at chemistry or something, but you're too lazy. You don't really want to develop yourself. Um, can you will that to be a universal law? Anybody can just be lazy and do whatever they want and not develop their talents? No, you can't. Reason would never agree to that. Reason would always say, what can you will be universal law? Everyone should develop their talents. So it's irrational to have a talent and to not use it. What about whether or not to be generous? Well, can you will that to be a universal law? Why would you not want to be generous? Oh, because I kind of want to buy myself stuff. Because I want this and I want that. And so you can't will it to be a universal law. So you should be generous. You can't give all your money away, but to have a good will, you have to will to give some money away when you can, because that's what you would want everyone to do, and that's what reason requires. Okay, so sometimes so in theory, you should be able to set up a whole system of moral laws that are categorical imperatives. This is what everyone should do. but they're not necessarily true because people have choice and they won't necessarily do it. You can argue with somebody and say, you really should not tell a lie, and they'll still tell a lie, right? But the categorical imperative was that if you had a good will, you would not have told a lie. But you didn't have a good will. That was the problem. All right. So here's some examples. So people with a Kantian approach would like to create a system, and there is a prioritizing of duties. For example, I had a great uncle, and he was a Baptist preacher in World War II, and he lived in Denmark, and he was on the underground. So the Jews were escaping from Germany by going from one house to another, and they went to his church, and they hid in the attic of the church before they could go across the sea and get to Sweden or Norway. And the Gestapo would come to the door and say, are you hiding Jews? And so what are you supposed to say, right? Uh, are you supposed to tell the truth and say, yeah, they're right up there in the attic, you can go get them because I cannot tell a lie? Or do you prioritize and say, number one priority is never to treat human beings as a means, always to treat them as an end, never as a means only. So the Gestapo were treating the Jews as means only. Definitely, they were going to kill them. And so it's the priority of preserving, saving people from being treated by people who are going to use them as a means or telling a lie. It's more important to tell the lie, right? If you have a good will, in this case, you will tell a lie. Okay. Okay, the Greeks, with their model of good judgment, have an example of Odysseus. Their basic theory is, well, most of the time you shouldn't lie, but there are times when lying is the best thing to do. There are good people who do things they otherwise would never do because of the circumstances. And it still is the best thing to do in the circumstances. So practical wisdom is all about the circumstances, right? Wisdom is only achieved in circumstances. Now, Kant's view is much more detached from circumstances, right? It's not, you never do something because of the consequences or because of the circumstances. I think even when the Gestapo wants to kill the Jews, it's not because there's anything circumstantial about it. It's about somebody is trying to treat somebody else as a means only. This is a case of that. And so it's not relative to circumstances. It's the principle of the thing that the Gestapo is violating the number one principle, never to treat people as a means only. That's the number one principle. And so you can violate what would otherwise be a universal principle if that number one principle is being violated. Primary and secondary duties, I guess, is how they do it. Okay, so in the story of Odysseus and the, oh God, Cyclops. All right. So Odysseus is trying to get home and he lands on an island and there's a cave and his fellow Greeks are sleeping in the cave. And the Cyclops puts a boulder at the head of the cave and eats them. Each day he consumes one of those soldiers. And Odysseus has to figure out how to get out of this. And so he climbs under the stomach of a sheep and see. how does he blinds the Cyclops, right? So the Cyclops can't see. And then Odysseus can get out because the Cyclops doesn't feel him. He doesn't, there's no body there that he can tell is there. He just knows about the sheep. So he gets out, he gets onto the boat. So Odysseus, the Cyclops says, "Who's there?" And he says, "Nobody." So he's lying, right? It's not nobody. And that's an insult to Odysseus because he's not a nobody, he's a somebody. But he lies. And then he gets onto the ship. And then he tells the truth, which he shouldn't have done because it was an act of arrogance. He said, "Hey, Cyclops, you want to know who blinded you? Odysseus, the son of Laertes, or no, Laertes. That's right." So, yeah. So that's an example where it's okay to lie in the circumstances, and it's bad to tell the truth in other circumstances. So Odysseus thought he was going to get home because, hey, he's free. He got free from the Cyclops. But the Cyclops had a friend, Poseidon, the god of the sea, who could arrange for the winds to blow. And so Odysseus, it took 10 more years for him to get home because Poseidon made his life miserable. So the idea is that was an act of pride, and he shouldn't have told the truth because it was arrogant. He got caught for it. So anyway, the whole Greek thing is much more circumstantial. The person of practical wisdom knows what to do in the circumstances. And Kant is not circumstantial. It tries to avoid and no exceptions are based on circumstances. The exceptions are based on a conflict of duties. Each of those duties is a categorical imperatives. It's just that when you cannot do both of them, one of them takes priority over another one. So that's Kant. All right. Now, the next step is what happens, how these theories get corrupted. And in Germany, so I'm going to give you an example of Germany. Maybe I'll stop for now and I'll see. I guess I'll stop this one for now and we'll have the next lecture will be how you can apply Kant and Descartes